Emma Carter was just a child. She had no power, no voice, no home. Her father had done everything right, worked hard, stayed honest. But life didn't care. When the rent came due, when the bills piled up, when her mother's accident left them with nothing, the world turned its back. Now, at just 9 years old, Emma sat in the cold, clutching her last $100, her father beside her, defeated, until she walked into the wrong alley, until she saw the wrong man in trouble. Now, a billionaire in disguise stands in shock, and a cruel debt collector storms off with the only money she had left, and Emma's left with nothing. Or so she thinks. Because that homeless man, that wasn't just any man. And that $100, that wasn't just money. It was a test, and Emma just changed her life forever. Just before we get back to it, where are you joining us from today? Let me know in the comments. And if you're loving this story, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode is even more amazing. A bitter wind swept through the city, cutting through the thin jacket wrapped around a 9-year-old girl's small frame. She pulled her knees closer to her chest, pressing against the man beside her, her father. He sat still, staring at the crumpled $100 bill in his hands, their last bit of money, the only thing keeping them from complete helplessness, the last piece of security in a life that had unraveled too fast. "This is all we have left, Emma," Daniel murmured. His voice was rough, worn down by weeks of exhaustion. He wasn't just tired, he was out of options. "We have to be careful with it." Emma didn't answer. She already knew what the money was for. Part of it was supposed to help with her father's medical bills. The rest, well, she had one wish. A simple one, a bicycle. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive. Just something to make her feel like a kid again. Her birthday was coming up. But deep down, she wondered if her father even remembered. But in this moment, there were no millionaires, no miracles, just a father and daughter on a cold bench, struggling to hold on to hope. Emma's fingers tightened around the edges of her thin sweater as she watched her father, Daniel, staring at the $100 bill like it could somehow rewrite the past. But it couldn't. Nothing could. They weren't always like this. Just months ago, Emma had a home, a warm bed, a room filled with her mother's laughter, and the scent of fresh pancakes on Sunday mornings. Her mother, Lily, had been the glue that held their little world together. But all it took was one moment, one stretch of road, one careless driver, to tear everything apart. The day of the accident had started like any other. Emma had waved goodbye to her mother as she left for work, never knowing it would be the last time she'd see her. Daniel had tried to be strong after that. He told Emma they'd be okay, that they'd figure it out. But grief doesn't wait for you to find a plan. It swallows you whole. And as much as Daniel fought to stay afloat, the weight was too much. Then came the accident at the construction site. He wasn't supposed to be there that day. He had taken on an extra shift because the bills were piling up. He had promised Emma ice cream after work, but instead, he ended up in the emergency room. A shattered ankle, torn ligaments, and a company that had no use for a worker who couldn't stand on his own 2 feet. They tried to hold on. Rent was due, and Daniel was determined to pay it. He sent out job applications, knocked on doors, begged for work, but no one wanted a man who couldn't move without a crutch. Within weeks, the eviction notice came. Emma could still hear the landlord's voice, cold and final. "You have 3 days. 3 days to pack up their life. 3 days to say goodbye to the only home they had left." And so, here they were, living in shelters when there was space, sleeping on park benches when there wasn't. Daniel told Emma it was temporary, that something would change. But Emma could see the doubt in his eyes, the weight of a man who had lost too much. Yet, even in the darkness, she held on to hope. Emma pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket and smoothed it out on her lap. It was a drawing, one she had worked on for days. 3 figures stood hand in hand, a smiling little girl, a man with kind eyes, and a woman with flowing hair. Their family, whole again. She hesitated for a second, then gently placed the drawing on her father's lap. "One day, we'll have a real home again, Dad," she whispered. Daniel's hands trembled as he picked up the picture. He traced his fingers over the lines of Lily's face, swallowing hard. For the first time in weeks, his eyes weren't just tired. They were glassy with something else. Something unspoken. Emma didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but in that moment, as she leaned her head against her father's arm, she believed in something bigger than their pain. She believed that one day, things would change. She just didn't know how soon that day would come. The wind whispered through the nearly empty park as Emma curled up beside her father on the cold wooden bench. The night stretched out before them, quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hum of passing cars. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around herself, glancing up at her father, Daniel, as he turned the worn $100 bill over in his fingers. That single bill, the last of everything they had. Emma knew it wasn't much. In a world where everything cost more than they could afford, $100 could disappear in an instant. But to her it meant something more. It was a promise that tomorrow, for her birthday, she might have something to hold on to, something to remind her of the life they used to have before everything fell apart. Daniel let out a slow breath, his expression unreadable as he studied the money. "Tomorrow's your birthday, sweetheart," he said finally, his voice gentle yet tired. "And I know it's not much, but I thought maybe we could finally get you that bike your mom always wanted you to have. A second-hand one, but a good one." Emma's heart jumped. A bicycle. Not just any bicycle, but the one her mother had dreamed of getting her before she... Emma pushed the thought away. She didn't want to think about that now. "Really?" she asked, sitting up straighter. Daniel forced a small smile. "Yeah, and whatever's left, I'll use for my checkup." Emma's excitement hesitated, her gaze drifting down to his leg. Even though he tried to hide it, she had seen the way he struggled to walk, the way his hands gripped his knee when he thought she wasn't looking. The injury from the accident at the construction site had stolen his ability to work, and after months of missed rent payments, the landlord had kicked them out. Now, every step he took was laced with pain. "Only if we still have enough for you, Dad," she said, her voice firm. Daniel chuckled, ruffling her hair. "That's not how birthdays work, kid. This is for you." But Emma shook her head. "No, Mom would say family takes care of each other first." Daniel's smile faltered, his throat tightening. Lily had always said things like that. Even when they had nothing, she had found ways to make their little family feel whole. She had been the glue that held them together, the warmth in every cold season. And now, she was gone. For a moment, Daniel said nothing. And then he wrapped an arm around Emma's small shoulders and pulled her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You're just like her, you know," he murmured. Emma looked up at him. "I hope so." Daniel swallowed hard and glanced away. The night pressed around them, quiet and heavy. Emma shivered but didn't complain. She was used to the cold by now. "Do you think things will ever be like before?" she asked after a while. Daniel hesitated. He wished he had an answer for her. He wished he could promise that someday they'd have a real home again, that she'd have a birthday party with candles and cake, that they'd go back to lazy Sunday mornings where Lily would hum old songs in the kitchen while making pancakes. But he couldn't lie to her. "I don't know, sweetheart," he admitted. "But I do know that no matter what, I'll always take care of you." Emma nodded, as if accepting a truth much bigger than her 9-year-old heart should have to bear. Emma leaned against him, resting her head on his arm, and together they sat in silence. In his other hand, the $100 bill remained. It wasn't just money anymore. It was something more than that. One piece of paper, one last chance. Neither of them could have known that by tomorrow it would be gone, and that in its place, something far greater was waiting. Emma's stomach growled, but although she ignored it because she was used to it, Daniel knew they had to search for food. "Let's go find something to eat," he said softly. They both walked slowly on the sidewalk. Emma clutched her father's hand as they walked, the cold pavement rough beneath her worn-out sneakers. Daniel walked slower than usual, his limp more pronounced tonight. Emma pretended not to notice, just like she always did. She knew he hated when she worried about him. "We'll find something soon," he assured her, though there was doubt in his voice. They had been searching for food, anything at all, hoping a kind restaurant owner might have leftovers, or maybe a stranger would spare some change. But so far, the city had only given them silence. Then, a sharp voice cut through the quiet. "You think this is funny, old man?" Emma jerked, her eyes darting toward the alleyway just ahead. She could make out two figures. One was an older man, frail and hunched, dressed in ragged layers that barely clung to his bony frame. His beard was unkempt, his hands trembling. The other man, taller, younger, mean, towered over him, his face twisted with anger. I didn't mean to," the old man stammered, raising his hands as if to ward off an invisible blow. "You broke my phone. Do you know how much that cost?" The aggressor snapped, stepping forward. His voice dripped with venom, his movements sharp, unpredictable. People like you don't just get to walk away from something like this. Emma's grip on her father's hand tightened. Dad? She whispered. Daniel had already stopped walking. His tired eyes quivered with something else now. Concern. Stay here, he murmured. But Emma wasn't going anywhere. The old man shook his head desperately. I swear I didn't. Liar! The younger man shoved him hard, and the old man stumbled back, barely catching himself against the brick wall. Emma gasped. Daniel took a step forward. Hey! The aggressor turned, his eyes narrowing as he sized up Daniel. This isn't your problem, he spat. Daniel didn't back down. It is now. Emma's heart pounded as she glanced at the old man. He looked helpless. His shoulders shook as he braced himself, his face lined with exhaustion and fear. How long had he been out here? Had he eaten today? Did he have anywhere to go? The younger man sneered, rolling his shoulders. You want to play hero? He said, stepping toward Daniel now. Because I'm really not in the mood for this. Emma felt her breath fasten. Her father was strong. He had worked in construction after all, but his injury had made him weak. If this man attacked him, she couldn't let that happen. She stepped forward before she could stop herself. Stop! Both men turned to her. Leave him alone, she said, forcing herself to sound braver than she felt. The aggressor scoffed, looking her up and down before letting out a short laugh. Ha ha ha. Oh, this is cute. What are you going to do, kid? Emma's hands clenched into fists. The old man suddenly reached out, placing a trembling hand on her sleeve. It's all right, he whispered. But it wasn't. Nothing about this was all right. And then the man lunged. Daniel moved fast, stepping in front of Emma, but the old man, he did something unexpected. His frail body shifted slightly, his tired eyes sharpening just enough for a flash of something unreadable to pass through them. It was so quick. Emma almost missed it. The aggressor grabbed his collar, shaking him. You're paying for my phone, one way or another. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't know why, but something about the old man's expression, just for a split second, felt off. Not in a bad way, just different. As if there was more to him than what they were seeing, but that didn't matter right now. Because if they didn't do something, this man was going to get hurt, and they had nothing. No home, no safety, no protection. Except for that last $100 bill tucked in Daniel's pocket. Emma's mind raced. She had to do something, but what? Emma's fingers tightened around the edges of her worn jacket, her mind racing. Her father's breathing was heavier now. He wasn't supposed to be pushing himself like this. Every movement sent a jolt of pain through his injured leg, and yet he stood protectively between her and the aggressor, refusing to back down. But how long could he hold his ground? The old man, Mr. Harold, shrank against the cold brick wall, his shoulders pulled inward, his face filled with something that looked an awful lot like fear. His hands shook, and Emma couldn't tell if it was from the cold or from something else entirely. This isn't right, she thought. This isn't fair. The younger man smirked, shifting his weight from one foot to the other as if he were deciding whether or not to escalate the situation. He crossed his arms, eyes darting between them before speaking. Look, I'm not unreasonable. He pays me, and I walk away. Simple. Emma swallowed hard. How much? The words left her mouth before she even realized she had spoken. The aggressor turned his gaze to her, eyebrows raising slightly. What? Emma steadied herself. How much to fix your phone? For a brief moment, there was silence. Even Daniel glanced at her, concern flashing across his face. The man scoffed, tilting his head as he pulled his cracked phone from his pocket, holding it up between two fingers like it was some sort of proof of injustice. Screen's busted. Probably gonna cost $100, maybe more. 100. The number hit her like a punch to the stomach. Their 100. The only thing keeping her and her father from having absolutely nothing left. With it, she could have her second-hand bicycle, something her mother had always dreamed of giving her. With it, her father could finally get his checkup before his injury got even worse. And without it, her throat tightened. She looked at Mr. Harold again. His hands had curled into fists, but they weren't clenched with anger. They were trembling. He was scared. Scared in the same way she and her father had been scared when their landlord had banged on the door, when the eviction notice had been taped to their window, when the last of their belongings had been carried away, leaving them with nothing but each other. Emma reached into her father's coat pocket before she could second-guess herself. Her fingers brushed against the worn edges of the bill, the paper slightly wrinkled from being handled too many times. It was the last bit of security they had. Could she really do this? Let me ask you, would you do the same if you were in this kind of situation? Please drop a reply in the comment. Her father noticed what she was doing too late. Emma, wait. That's our last money. She stepped forward, her small hand stretching toward the man. Please, sir, she said softly. Take this instead. Just let him go. The wind pressed against her as the moment stretched. Daniel stiffened beside her, his jaw tightening. The aggressor looked from her face to the money, his lips curling into something between amusement and disbelief. You're kidding. She shook her head. Please, just take it. For a second, it almost seemed like he might refuse, like he wanted to argue. But then, with a scoff, he reached out and snatched the bill from her hand. Whatever. Not worth the trouble. And just like that, he turned on his heel and walked away. Emma barely registered the sound of his footsteps fading down the sidewalk. Her heart pounded. As she let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Mr. Harold was staring at her. Not just staring, really looking at her. His tired, weathered face was frozen in shock, his thin lips slightly parted. Why? He asked. My mother always said that the only way to make this world a better place is by helping one another. She replied calmly. Daniel went over to the old man and helped him to his feet. Thanks for your kindness. I'll never forget, Mr. Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. He patted Daniel's shoulder, a gesture of gratitude that spoke volumes. He bent over to Emma and said, You're a good girl. The world needs more people like you. Emma gave a slight nod, walked over to her dad, and they both continued their search for food. Having no luck in getting food, Emma and her father sat on an old wooden bench, its surface rough beneath them. The air had a sharp bite, sinking deep into their bones, and no matter how tightly Emma tucked her arms against herself, the chill remained. But the cold wasn't the worst part. It was the emptiness. The pocket where their last $100 had been was now light as air, and the weight of what that meant settled heavily in Daniel's chest. I should have stopped you. His voice was quiet, but the frustration seeped through. He rubbed his temples, the exhaustion making him look even older than he was. Emma sat still, watching the distant headlights from passing cars. It was the right thing to do, Dad. The right thing? Daniel let out a breath, shaking his head. Emma, that was all we had. Emma turned to him, her wide eyes steady. He needed it more. Daniel pressed his lips together. There was no anger in his expression, only helplessness. How could he explain to his little girl that sometimes kindness wasn't enough? That sometimes, no matter how much you wanted to help someone else, you had to put yourself first? His body ached. His leg pulsed with a dull, relentless pain, reminding him that he needed to get it checked. But now, there was no money for that. No money for food. No money for anything. Emma's stomach let out a quiet rumble, but she didn't complain. She never did. How long had it been since she'd had a proper meal? How long had he forced her to live like this? Daniel ran a hand down his face, guilt crashing over him. This isn't how it was supposed to be. He was supposed to protect her, to give her a better life. And yet, here they were, hungry and cold, shivering beneath the stars like they didn't belong anywhere. Tomorrow, he muttered. Tomorrow I'll find work. Anything. We'll figure something out. Emma nodded, but there was something in her gaze, something deep, like she already knew that finding work wasn't that easy. She scooted closer to him, resting her head against his arm. Mom always said things get worse before they get better. Daniel swallowed hard. Yeah. But what if things didn't get better? What if this was just the beginning of something even harder? His breath hitched slightly as a new, terrifying thought settled in. What if his body gave out before he could fix this? What if Emma ended up alone? The morning arrived, sluggishly, the sky painted in soft hues, as the first light crept over the quiet streets. Emma stirred beneath her thin blanket, her small fingers curled into the fabric as if holding onto the last bit of warmth. Her father hadn't slept much. She could tell by the way his eyes stayed half open, his breaths uneven. But then, something interrupted the stillness. A low hum, the sound of an engine. Emma sat up, blinking at the sight of a sleek black luxury car pulling up to the curb. The contrast was almost jarring against the backdrop of cracked pavement and the faded wooden bench they had slept on. Her father stiffened beside her. Who would drive a car like that in a place like this? The back door opened with a quiet click. A man stepped out, his polished shoes touching the ground with careful grace. He wasn't just any man. He was familiar. Emma's breath caught. The frail, homeless man from yesterday was gone, and in his place stood someone entirely different. His posture was strong, his silver hair neatly combed, and his suit, so pristine it looked as though not a single wrinkle had dared to touch it. "Emma, do you remember me?" Emma's eyes widened. The voice was the same. The face, though now clean-shaven, was unmistakable. It was him, the same man she had saved with their last $100. Her father shifted beside her, still tense. "Who are you?" Daniel's voice was hoarse, a mix of suspicion and confusion. The man gave a small smile, one that carried something deeper, something unreadable. "My name is Harold Whitmore. You may have heard of me." Daniel inhaled sharply, recognition flashing in his gaze. Harold Whitmore, the billionaire. The name belonged to a man whose wealth was spoken about in headlines, whose face was often paired with words like powerful and untouchable. He's the CEO of the largest tech company in the city and beyond. Emma looked between them, trying to make sense of it all. "But yesterday, you were homeless?" Harold finished for her. Emma nodded, her heart pounding. "I was," he said, his voice calm and measured. "Or at least, I wanted people to think I was." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "Why?" Harold's gaze shifted, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then with a sigh, he spoke. "Because I had to know if there were still good people in this world." The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. "What do you mean?" Emma asked, her small voice cutting through the silence. Harold hesitated, then looked at her with something almost like admiration. "I lost faith in people a long time ago, Emma. My own family, they betrayed me, stabbed me in the back when all I ever did was try to help them. It made me question everything. It made me wonder, does kindness even exist anymore? Or is it just a mask people wear when they want something?" Emma swallowed, his words settling deep in her chest. "So, you pretended to be homeless, just to see how people would treat you?" Harold nodded. "And you'd be surprised how many people looked right through me. Some avoided me, some cursed at me, others simply pretended I didn't exist." He exhaled, shaking his head. "But you had nothing, and yet you gave everything." A lump formed in Emma's throat. Harold stepped closer, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. "Why, Emma? Why did you do it?" Emma glanced at her father, then back at Harold. "Because..." She hesitated, trying to find the right words. "Because you looked like you needed it more than we did." Harold stared at her, something flashing behind his gaze. Then, to her surprise, he laughed. A genuine deep chuckle. "You see, that's exactly why I'm here." Emma tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Harold's smile faded into something more serious. "Because I've made my decision." "Decision?" Emma glanced at her father, who still looked wary, his body stiff. "Decision about what?" Daniel asked cautiously. Harold looked back at Emma, his gaze unwavering. "About who deserves a second chance." The weight of those words settled over them. Emma's heart pounded. What did he mean? What was he about to say? And more importantly, what would happen next? Emma stood frozen as Harold's words echoed in her ears. About who deserves a second chance. What did that mean? She turned to her father, but he looked just as lost, his tired eyes scanning Harold's face for an answer. Harold didn't make them wait long. Reaching into his coat pocket, he pulled out a small, crisp envelope. He held it out toward Emma. "Take it." Emma hesitated. She glanced up at her father, silently asking for guidance. Daniel's voice was low, careful. "What is it?" Harold's lips curved slightly, but there was something deeper in his expression. "A gift." Emma's small fingers brushed against the envelope as she slowly took it from his grasp. The paper felt smooth but firm, heavier than she expected. Her heart pounded as she flipped it over and carefully pulled out what was inside. And then her breath caught. A check for her hands trembled. $1 million. The words barely escaped her lips. Daniel jolted upright beside her. "What?" His voice cracked, his eyes widening in disbelief. Harold simply nodded. "Yes, it's real." Emma's vision blurred as tears welled up in her eyes. But why?" she stammered, gripping the check tighter, as if afraid it might disappear. Harold took a deep breath, looking at her with something that almost resembled pride. "Because kindness like yours is rare, Emma. and I don't believe in letting rare things go unnoticed. Daniel still looked like he couldn't breathe. His hands clenched into fists. Then he relaxed, as if trying to ground himself in reality. I don't know what to say, he admitted, shaking his head. Harold gave a small chuckle. Then don't say anything just yet. There's more. More? Emma didn't think her heart could take any more surprises, but Harold wasn't finished. Come with me. Daniel hesitated, but Emma stood without thinking. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was hope. Harold turned toward his car, and Emma followed, her father close behind. The driver, who had been silently waiting, opened the back door. Get in, Harold said. Emma looked up at her father again, her eyes questioning. Daniel swallowed hard, but finally gave a small nod. And just like that, for the first time in a long time, Emma climbed into a car that wasn't old, wasn't cold, and wasn't falling apart. It smelled of fresh leather and something warm, something safe. She wasn't sure how long they drove. Minutes? Hours? Time felt strange when everything around her was shifting so fast. But when they stopped, Emma's breath fastened as she stared at what stood in front of her. A bicycle, a brand new, gleaming red bicycle stood right there on the sidewalk in front of them. Emma didn't move. Go on, Harold urged. Emma turned to him, still gripping the check in one hand, as if afraid to let go of either reality or a dream. Is it really mine? Of course, Harold said, nodding toward it. Happy birthday, Emma. Her chest tightened, emotions crashing over her all at once. Slowly, as if stepping into another life, she walked toward the bike. Her fingers ran along the cool metal of the handles. The wheels were perfect. The seat was soft. It was hers. Her father was silent behind her, but she knew. She knew he was feeling every bit of this, just as much as she was. Emma climbed onto the seat, her heart racing. She hadn't ridden a bike in so long. She pushed forward. The wheels rolled, and suddenly she was flying. The wind kissed her cheeks as she pedaled faster, her laughter bubbling up before she could stop it. Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't care. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emma wasn't running from something. She was riding toward something, toward hope, toward a future, toward home, because that's what Harold had given them next. Not just a check, not just a bike, but a place to belong. And as Daniel stood there watching his daughter ride with pure joy, Harold placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Your hospital bills are covered, he said. And your job? That's taken care of too. You start next week. Daniel's lips parted, but no words came. His eyes glistened, his throat working as he struggled to hold it together. I don't know how to thank you, he finally choked out. Harold smiled. You already did. Relief, hope, and then something unexpected. Laughter. Soft at first, then growing, as if Daniel himself couldn't believe this was real. Emma slowed her bike to a stop, her chest rising and falling as she took in the moment. You were right, Emma, he said, shaking his head in disbelief. Something good did happen. Emma felt her throat tighten. She had wanted to believe that for so long, even when things seemed impossible, even when the nights were cold and the hunger was unbearable, even when they had nothing left. And now, here they were. Harold watched them for a long moment before crouching down beside Emma, his voice softer now. Kindness always comes back in ways we never expect, he told her. You gave away everything you had for someone you barely knew, and look what happened. Emma blinked, thinking back to the moment she had clutched their last $100 in her hand. She could still hear the rough voice of the man demanding money, and the fear in Harold's eyes as he played his part. She had been scared, but she had given it away anyway, not because she expected anything in return, but because it was the right thing to do. She looked down at her hands, then back at her father. Do you think Mom would be proud? She asked, hesitantly. Daniel's breath paused, then he bent over to her. I know she would. Tears rolled down Emma's eyes, but this time they weren't from sadness. They were from something new, something warm, something like home. As they stood there, the world around them seemed to be quiet, as if the universe itself had paused to acknowledge what had just happened. A single act of kindness had changed everything, and as Emma took her father's hand, squeezing it tightly, she realized something. Sometimes, when you have nothing left to give, that's when kindness means the most. Would you have done what Emma did? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories.